Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have an interesting hand from early in a $7,500 buy-in World Poker Tour event. They're going to fold around to me and I'm going to get ace-5 offsuit in the small blind with about a, very deep stack. 130 big blinds. So I'm just going to limp here. And I'm going to limp with the majority of my range. I have definitely started limping with many of my hands from the small blind versus players who are competent. If your opponent in the big blind is just way too tight, you can certainly raise to 600. Well, we're playing 100 or 200. So you can certainly raise to 3 big blinds or 3.5 big blinds or maybe even 4 big blinds. And if you're going to steal the pot half the time or more, well, that's just going to show a very nice amount of profit. But if your opponent is reasonable and he's going to call a ton, as he certainly should, then you definitely want to play as small of a pot as possible from out of position while still getting to see the flop. And notice here, if I limp and then my opponent makes it 600, well, I can easily call with ace-5. Whereas if I raise and he calls, well, we're out of position playing a marginal ace-high, which is not really where you want to be. And if he 3-bets me, well, if I call, then we're playing a big pot out of position with ace-high, which is also where you don't want to be. We could conceivably 4-bet then, but like, what are we doing at that point? Now we're just playing a huge pot for no reason. So the way that you can ensure you see a relatively cheap flop is to limp, and then if your opponent checks, that's great. If your opponent raises, that's also fine. If your opponent raises big, like to say 5 big blinds or 8 big blinds or something like that, you can just fold and then understand you're going to limp with a lot of hands, and when your opponent blasted, he's going to eventually pay you off for way too much when you happen to get a good hand. So I like this limping strategy. It's an easy one to adopt. When I limp here, I limp re-raise my best hands, and I limp re-raise some of my junky suited connectors and offsuit connectors. That's going to be a pretty nice strategy because when your opponent calls your 4-bet or your limp raise 3-bet, he is going to have most likely big-ish cards, not great cards, but hands like queen jack and whatnot. And you either want to be dominating him or you want to be sure that your cards are so low to where you're often not dominated. And the way you do that is by you playing your absolute best hands as the limp re-raise, or by playing your very junky hands that are perhaps not quite strong enough to just call the re-raise from out of position. So that's roughly what I'm doing here. Anyway, I discuss this a lot in my upcoming book. Actually, it may be out by now. Mastering Small Stakes, No Limit Hold'em. I outlined this whole strategy. Of course, if your opponent's just tight, just raise every hand from the small blind. All right, so anyway, we flop top pair, which is great. I bet 225. This seems pretty standard. You don't need to bet big here, given my opponent could very easily have all sorts of junk, and you want to keep him in the pot. If you think about which turns should be bad for me, it's going to be an 8, a 7, a 6, a 4, and a 3. Because all those hands, or all those cards, will improve my opponent's most likely flop calling hands. Many players raise with an ace on the flop. And notice, even if he has an ace, and that he did not decide to raise, we lose to virtually all of them. We only beat ace-3 and ace-2. And even then, we're probably going to chop with those by the river. A decent amount of the time, at least. So we are losing to all the aces. If our opponent had a hand like 8-7, he just improved. If he had 8-4, he just improved. Of course, that's not too many hands. But notice if he had a hand like 8-6, he improved to some equity. If he had a hand like, 6-5 got there. If he had a hand like 5-4, he just turned to gut shot. But of course, we have that gut shot beat. So we're not worried about that hand. But any hand with a 6 just improved a lot. And also any backdoor diamond draw. If he had a hand like 10 or jack 7 of jack, what am I saying? If you had a hand like jack 10 of diamonds or jack 9 of diamonds, those hands just improved a lot. And I do think a lot of people will call a small flop bet with the backdoor draws, as they should. So anyway, this is a spot where I certainly could bet the turn. If I bet, I think I can go kind of big. But really, are we getting much value here? The problem with betting is that if I get called, I can't really justify value betting the river. So I'm checking the river and then check calling. I think that would be okay. Alternatively, I can check call the turn very easily. If it goes check, check, I can be happy enough. But here, I check, my opponent bets 500 for half pot, and I have a very easy call. And I think this is pretty standard. River's a king. I check, and now my opponent bets 1,500 into a 2,075 pot. So now, would my opponent bet with a hand like 7-6? Because you want to ask yourself at this point, which bluffs make sense for your opponent to have to bet this river for this size? Well, the only hands that make a lot of sense to bet this size are the unpaired hands. And that's going to be primarily 10-9, Jack-9, Jack-10, then stuff like Queen-Jack and Queen-10 if he had those with backdoor flush draws. Notice if my opponent had a king, you would not think you would bet this size, although he really shouldn't have very many kings. If he had a hand like 9-7, would he really try to make me fold an ace? Seems pretty optimistic, right? If he had 7-3 or 7-6, would he really try to make me fold an ace? Probably not. So in order for my opponent to actually even have very many combinations of bluffs here, first off, he had to float with a lot of hands, because many of the hands that would naturally call the flop with a draw, like 8-5, for example, improve to a pair that would no longer want to bluff. So he had to have floated the flop with all those. He had to also bet the turn with all those. And then he also has to bet the river with all those. And that's a little bit optimistic. So if he's only bluffing here with the unpaired hands, then I think I actually have a very easy fold. Because we essentially lose to all value hands, if you think about it, right? We lose to most of the aces. And, some of the weaker aces may not even bet. So we lose to all the aces. We lose to the two pairs, which would certainly bet medium on the turn and bet larger on the river. He could have a hand like King 7 that bet the turn for value, or a hand like King 8 that bet the turn for value and then got there on the river that he can now value bet big. I guess that makes some sense too. I'm just having a hard time coming up with very many obvious bluffs. So next thing you want to ask yourself is, are there many unnatural bluffs that your opponent would actually bet? So would he bet 5-4? Would he bet 7-6? These hands that a lot of people think have showdown value. And if your opponent's a good, aggressive player, I would say yes, there probably are, and I have a very easy call. But we have this guy labeled as a tight, aggressive local. Well, first off, you have to understand your tags could just be wrong. You don't necessarily know everything about your opponent, and for all we know, maybe this guy has just decided to bluff me for no good reason. But most of the time, local players tend to not look at a hand like 7-6 or 8-6 and decide, I'm going to try to bluff a guy off of an ace. That's just not what they do. They decide, I'm going to check behind here and hope to win when my opponent has 5-4, which is a reasonable assessment. Also, most people who are tight and aggressive tend to not take marginal made hands and turn them into bluffs. If your opponent was a maniac or even just an overly loose aggressive player, those are the type of players who look to turn stuff into bluffs. So the fact that I have this guy labeled as a tight aggressive local, and the fact that he bet the turn and bet the river, makes me think that he's not trying to exploit my, quote unquote obvious weakness with a hand like Ace-5, because I did play my hand a little bit timidly on the turn and on the river. And instead, it makes me think this guy's probably just value betting and hoping to get called. So I think I like a fold here, but like I said, if I knew my opponent was just a good player, I could certainly see calling being the only option that makes much sense. And I actually do like a call here, especially if I'm check calling the turn with a lot of hands like 7-5 and 7-6 and 8-6. I think if I'm check folding those on the river, then obviously I need to be calling all my aces. So certainly an exploitable fold here. If my opponent's just bluffing me every time, I'm folding way too often. But if you told me a tight, aggressive local guy, probably someone who satellited into this WPT event, is that guy really just going to try to bluff me early in a tournament for no reason off of either a middle pair or a top pair? Probably not. So that's going to be it for this hand. I can already feel the comments coming in. People saying, oh my God, I can't believe he folded. This guy clearly bluffed. Don't fold top pair, etc., etc. But I think I've outlined why I like it in this exact spot, and maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you all want to run some equity calculations using Flopzilla or a PO Solver or Card Runners EV, feel free to do it. Link me to a picture of it, and I will take a look, and you can prove me wrong. But against the majority of people who I don't think are going to be that creative, I think this is going to be a fold for the most part. So thank you very much for watching. Again, if you enjoy these videos here on Poker News, let them know. And I'll be back next week with another educational poker hand. Thanks for watching.